Hi, everybody, and welcome once again to At the Table with CAHSAH, presented by California Association for Health Services at Home. My name is Mark Wilson, and every week we bring you real conversations about important policy issues that CAHSAH is moving on, and hopefully some practical strategies that are shaping home care across California. On today's podcast, there's something happening in California right now that I'm sure has every hospice provider paying attention. Hundreds of agencies have had their Medicare payments suspended, not slowed down, not reviewed, but stopped. And in some cases, as I understand it, it's happening before a full investigation is even completed. So let's be clear up front. Fraud is real in hospice. It exists, and it should be rooted out aggressively. We all believe that. No one in this industry is defending bad actors. But here's the problem. When enforcement moves this fast, this broadly, and this publicly, the impact often doesn't stop with the bad actors. It has the potential to hit everybody. And you find yourself as an ethical provider suddenly, under suspicion. It, I believe, is hitting referral sources who are starting to hesitate a bit as to whether they're even going to refer the patients. And most importantly, it's hitting patients and families who, some of them now may question whether hospice is something they can trust at all. And the reason for that, in my opinion, is because the headlines are screaming fraud, fraud, fraud. And people don't differentiate between the few who are breaking the rules and the many who are doing the work the right way. So we are really pleased today to be joined at the table by Judy Waltz. She's a nationally recognized healthcare attorney and partner at Foley and Lardner. Judy leads the firm's healthcare practice group and is one of the industry's foremost experts on government investigations, Medicare and Medicaid compliance, and fraud and abuse enforcement. Simply put, when the regulatory pressure is at its highest, Judy is one of those voices providers turn to for clarity, strategy, and solutions. And again, we are so happy to have you here today. Welcome, Judy.
Thank you, and thank you for your kind words.
Also pulling up a chair to the table is CAHSAH's own Director of Policy, Advocacy, and Public Affairs, Tanya Batista. Hi, Tanya.
Hi, Mark.
How
Great
are
to be
you
back
today?
again.
Nice to see you all. So let me get this started, if you don't mind. And Judy, let's start here. There's lots of noise on this issue right now. And I know this is a very basic, very simple question, but what exactly is a Medicare payment suspension, and what exactly is triggering it right now?
So the authority that CMS, which is the Medicare agency, is relying on for these suspensions relates to an authority that was provided by the Affordable Care Act in 2010 that has not been used very broadly to date. But it allows for a suspension based upon a credible allegation of fraud, which is a pretty low standard. There's a lot of discussion both in the preamble to the regulations that implemented this after the statute allowed it, and also in some CMS guidance documents that make it clear that credible allegation of fraud is a pretty low standard. The statute itself says it can't just be a hotline complaint, because you can imagine, everybody and their brother could call with respect to their competitors or whomever. But it can relate to an investigation. It can relate to audit findings. What we're seeing with this round, and Dr. Oz indicated that there had been over 400 payment suspensions imposed in Los Angeles, which is a lot, particularly with respect to all occurring in one area. The statistics for what they imposed last year between January and November were about the same as what they've imposed in this one round here. So in one fell swoop. But what it seems to be that they're looking at is live discharge rate, which means who was discharged and they didn't die. Obviously, people usually go into hospice and they usually die because they're they're terminally ill.
Yeah, they graduated.
So live discharges, people who go elsewhere or who are discharged because there's some determination they're not terminal. And so what we think has been applied here is just a statistical rating of some sort. And again, this is just what we're piecing together from talking with a number of people, piecing together a certain percentage of patients that are discharged live. And then with respect to these notices, there's typically about 4 or 5 patients identified who have been live discharged. Now, some of those, I mean, you can think if CMS is looking through a database, they're not going to show why those people were discharged. So someone may move, a doctor may say they are actually not terminal, or they've improved a little bit. There are many reasons aside from fraud that a patient could be live discharged. From what Dr. Oz was saying last week to STAT, it seems that they're thinking that CMS is thinking that with too high a rate of live discharges, it reflects someone who is admitting people, and then getting rid of them when they didn't need hospice in the first place. So that seems to be the perception for fraud, but it's obviously catching a lot of people who are not engaging in fraudulent behavior.
So I just want to clarify something before I turn it
Yeah.
over to Tanya. If I understand you correctly, a credible allegation is something that hasn't really been fully vetted yet,
Correct.
which is
Correct.
that unusual?
Well, when this authority came out, so back in 2010, I really thought this was going to be like used in every case because the standard is pretty low. For the last, whatever it is, 15 years, it really has not been employed very broadly. The other thing I should note is that Medicaid is also expected to suspend if there's a Medicare suspension, and so that may be the second wave that's coming. It's not clear how long California will take to impose the Medicaid suspensions. So yeah, it's definitely at a very early stage in an investigation. If there is an investigation, a lot of these may not even have an investigation going on. It may just be the clear, the line in the sand, so to speak, where they have the live discharge
Wow.
rate.
Tanya?
Right. Yeah. No, thank you for that, Judy. And I think something that we also have discovered with some of our members here at CAHSAH is that the letters aren't always being received. So many of these providers are discovering that they've been suspended just by way of just checking their accounts and seeing that the payment they expected didn't come in. So they're having these experiences. So that's been brought to CAHSAH's attention because they're asking us what's going on, what's happening right now. Is this related to what we're seeing in the news? And so they're and some of them aren't putting it together in the sense of like they're not always in LA, right? We've received um correspondence with one member from CAHSAH who was in San Jose, right? So well outside the LA area. And these are hospice providers who've been operating, working to, continue to maintain supports in their community and provide access to care in a manner that they thought they were doing everything, appropriately, of course. And so within that scope, they're trying to also look at like, what steps can I take to address this effectively, and they want to do the right thing. They want to try to navigate this and partner with CMS, to the degree that they can and, respond in the manner that is, going to be successful for the community they serve and for the workforce that they support. And then ideally not disrupt too much of the patients who they're currently supporting at the end of their life. So what CASA did last Friday with you, Judy, of course, I just want to acknowledge is we had a live Q&A session just to support some of those who want to learn more about what's going on. We know in the news, in particular, that we're hearing, it's like they're saying, "Oh, none of these folks are asking questions. They're not, they're getting suspended, but they're not actually engaging in the process." So clearly, we've caught all this fraud. What we learned on Friday is that's not necessarily true. A lot of these folks are just learning about how this is being impacted. And Judy, so I want to thank you for being willing to um, answer some of these questions that these folks have, and how they can, engage. And I think one of the important processes that they need to engage in is obviously the rebuttal strategy, right? And what that means. I think you gave some really great advice there in terms of what that 15-day window looks like, and how to open that conversation.
Let me just build on what you were saying too. So one of the things that we learned in that session, as Tanya said, is that the letters had not been received. That is a different issue from the CMS authority to suspend payments, which they've done in this case prior to any notice. So it's just there are other types of payment suspension. So if you don't file your cost report, for example, it goes into automatic suspension. And then there's some other authorities that they can use as suspension. But for the most part, those require prior notice. Like as of 2 weeks from now, we are suspending your payments. With respect to a credible allegation of fraud, they don't have to give that advance notice. And here they did not give the advance notice. And then some people did not even get the letters telling them they were not getting the advance notice and that it had happened. So the only indication that they had was not getting the check on time. And
Mhm.
that's, or not checks in old-fashioned not getting the EFT deposit on time, which is really a hard way to do it. There were a couple people who indicated that their funds had also been clawed back, that they had
Mhm.
received them and they'd been clawed back. I've been trying to figure out logistically how that could have been done, and that's something I don't know if that's, like, physically, like, maybe there's some other screw up, or maybe they figured out how to do it. If that's happening, that's very serious, but I would need to see, like, the paperwork just to figure out, because, once it's in your bank account, it's, anyway, that's something logistically I can't quite put together in my head.
Hey, Judith.
Yeah, and it did seem like it was more than one person, though, that had that
I
experience. I
know,
think we
I
heard from
know.
actually a handful, just
Yeah,
because we weren't able to answer everyone. There was
right?
many hands. We had well over 140 participants in that Q&A session.
Yeah,
We gave less than 24-hour notice to
I
provide
know.
this, knowing that the 15-day rebuttal for many was well underway. So we wanted to support them, and with those participants, I mean, we weren't really able to answer everyone's hands raised. There was a lot of
Okay.
Q&A. I mean, you could see even those who didn't receive a letter or didn't have a suspension, they want to learn more about the process.
Quick question, Judith, is it even realistic for an organization to defend itself in that what did you say, 15-day window?
Yeah, so I think they have to, so there's no appeal on these suspensions. The only formal opportunity that you have to object is to file what's called a rebuttal, and there's only 15 days there. So uh, if as has been the typical letter that I've seen, they identify 5 patients, and they ask for certain medical records on those 5 patients, like the basics. It seems like they're basically trying to look. The CMS is looking to see if they're actual patients, as opposed to just made up ones or something, which would
Mhm.
be real fraud. So the response, then you send in their actual records, but also explain, for example, like if one of those 5 moved to Idaho, there's a reason they were a live discharge, or they, whatever it is happened. Some people, I guess, went to the hospital and then they were so a lot of different explanations aside from fraud for having these live discharges. So in the rebuttal period, or in the rebuttal response, you can identify why the sample of 5, which is obviously a very small sample anyway, but why that 5 isn't appropriate here. And then also, if there are reasons why a hospice is unique, and will, if they don't have money and they can't continue to operate, then they, theoretically at least might have to close down or not take new patients. Why that would be an access issue for Medicare beneficiaries. So, for example, if it was the only hospice in all of the state of California that spoke some language that no one else, speaks, that's one way to say that, this is important, for them to stay in business. It's important for access of Medicare beneficiaries, or, whatever it is that makes this hospice unique is going to be important. Because one of the reasons that, and sorry, I work in this space so much, I forget everybody else doesn't know as much about this as I do. So Medicare can lift a suspension based on a conclusion that it's not in the best interest of the Medicare program. And so that's why it's important to show why this particular hospice, or maybe it's the only hospice within, an LA County. It'd be hard to argue that there's distance of any sort, but it's the only hospice available by public whatever it is that makes it special in terms of the services that it provides to Medicare beneficiaries. That's going to be really important to have in the rebuttal.
Just I wanted to ask you this too. Do you think that generally speaking, are we entering an era of a more aggressive oversight period moving
Oh,
forward?
absolutely. Absolutely.
Do you have any
And
idea
this
what that's going to look like?
Yeah, so it's been really interesting. So I have a lot of years now, and a lot of years in my career, over 40, as someone just pointed out to me. And I started, working at HHS on the inside and working on payment suspensions, and here I am all these years later working on the other side. What's been interesting in the last few months is that CMS and DOJ, with, you know, as well, and supporting, HHS,
Mhm.
is pulling up all of these program integrity provisions from the Affordable Care Act. So, this is one of them, payment suspensions. The other thing we're seeing is, um, Medicare revocations of billing privileges, and that has been very, aggressive. All of these are steps that can be taken administratively, so, it's not the same as a DOJ investigation that goes on for years, and you may or may not know the first few years and then try and work it out the last few years. These they can just do quickly. So, like, with the suspensions, they just took this action, and now, they don't have to go through DOJ approvals and all of this, and they just take the action and then leave it up to appeal. So, the administrative appeals are also, which is where you get on the revocations, no appeal again on the suspension. Um, it the you can go through the process to get to an administrative law judge, but it takes a very long time to do so. So, I think we're seeing quick actions and then putting the burden on the provider and supplier to try and work them out after the fact, assuming they have the resources to do so.
Right.
Tanya, I haven't had a chance to share with you. I got a number of calls after that session last week from people who were talking about what their options really are in terms of these payment suspensions, and thinking about closing down, thinking about discharging patients,
Mhm.
having calls from other, eh, you know, uh, hospices that are saying, basically, "Are you gonna stay open? Could we transfer our it really seems like it's going to cause a lot of disruption in hospice care in the LA area.
Right. Well, and again, just to kind of emphasize too, like the statewide impact in addition to the LA, because um, the reality of it is with hospice care, and we know this from an industry standpoint, is the margins are tight.
Mhm.
These folks don't, they're in it because they really believe in what they're doing. They have the workforce who has a passion for providing hospice care and life support. But when you talk about can they carry their workforce for 180 days or more, I mean that's asking a lot for many of these.
Mhm.
organizations, these agencies. So I do know as of today, there's one, they're not a member of CAHSAH, but they've been in contact with us, and they did lay off their entire workforce while they're working through this. They discharged the majority of their patients except for two who are in such a situation that they're actually paying out of pocket to provide the care for those two because they want to make sure that they can receive the services they deserve. So this, I mean, that just shows how passionate these agencies are despite what they're going through.
And Tanya, maybe you can comment on how hospice is unique. I mean, both my parents died in hospice, and I'm just a
Hmm.
total supporter. But I think sometimes people don't realize why you can't just go to the doctor instead and get the same sort of care. So maybe you can explain a little bit about the
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm similar, Judy. My sister-in-law just passed away, and she was on hospice, and that was just incredibly valuable because I
Mhm.
can say we recently received another correspondence here at CAHSAH from a husband whose wife had to provide end of life support for her sister.
Okay.
And it was devastating for them because they weren't able to get hospice services. They requested it, they got the referral, but the service was not able to be provided to them, and it was extremely traumatic for his wife who when you're in this situation and you're trying to honor that this person wants to be at home in their last months and have that dignity at the end of their life, and you're trying to honor that, but then the end of life is a complex medical experience as well. And if you're not well versed in that, it can be something that can put you in question of like, did do I need to administer more medication or not enough medication or what is it that they need? And it can be just incredibly scary. And I remember when my sister-in-law was in her last day, it was terrifying for much of my family. They're like, is she going to open her eyes again? What's happening? And the hospice nurses were just incredibly valuable for providing that peace and that kind of serenity, if you will, in terms of what we could expect and how to support her. um, and so I mean hospice providers are just a critical home care support, and then when you look at it through the lens of state resources, right, and we talk about funding and budget issues, if these families have to put their patients back in the hospital setting, I mean, there's an incredible financial burden to taxpayers as well. So I don't want to miss that point because we do when we talk about hospice, we often talked about the spiritual aspect of it and how we can provide that support to families. But there is also the home care industry provides incredible savings to the state as well. And I think that's something that we often forget. So when we scream fraud, waste, and abuse, and we take this broad brush approach the way we're seeing it right now, we also don't recognize that we may be impacting our state from a budgetary standpoint. In addition to, when we look at Medicare, obviously that's a federal impact.
Let me add to it too, if I might. And that it was the subject of our last podcast. And again, we're hearing about hospice fraud now, and that's what we hear. So the result of that is oftentimes people lump every hospice in together. And I think that's why it's important for hospices in all the communities around the state of California to make sure that you're telling your story, to do your best to get out in front of it, because the media has their story. And if you're absolutely quiet about it, they're not going to know the other side of that. So I would encourage people to get out and tell your story. And if you have questions about that or need some assistance with that, get in touch with me, and I'm happy to help out. Happy to do what I can to help you navigate that process. So,
Exactly. And Mark, that's similar. I think we're all in it together. The three of us here on this call, as well as others who want to help, those relieve the impact on access to all these resources in particular, but um, the workforce aspect of it, the patient care, and just making sure that they have, resources in terms of like if there is legal counsel having that contact. Many of them don't know where to start, right? They when if they know that their funds have been suspended, What does that mean? Where do they start? What they've never received a letter like this before, obviously, or anything to this effect. So this is something that they're not sure what to do. And like Judy mentioned, many of them are already starting to consider how to lay off their workforce as they go through trying just to recuperate some funds to last through the process.
I'm wondering, Judith, if I'm a hospice CEO today, whether I've received the dreaded letter or not, what should I be doing immediately?
So I would look at the live discharge rate just and see what it's saying about you. Any other stats? This is the latest and the most aggressive effort, but a couple years ago it was length of stay that the
Hmm.
government was focused on. So now it's kind of the opposite. They stayed too long, and now they stayed too not enough long. So I would look at your stats, because this is what the government's going to be looking at, and compare your length of stay, compare your discharge rate. Any of the other focus that I've seen from DOJ in particular is high percentage of Alzheimer's patients, which,
Yeah.
unfortunately, our elderly population has a high percentage of Alzheimer's patients, but that's a story for another day. But anyway, I would look at your stats and just say, what message is this conveying? And then start to look at things that I'll give an example. This actually is a public example, but I won't identify who it was. I had one client who had very long length of stay. This one ended up in the newspaper. They had a 6 or 7 year stay in, in the hospice, which, I mean, good for them keeping the patient alive, but clearly there was something off in terms of what Medicare would expect, and looking at that. So if you do have those outliers, to look at them and say, I mean, this is the weak point that I've always seen is in the IDG, the IDT, interdisciplinary group, interdisciplinary team that's looking to see how patients are doing, and make sure your documentation is just really solid.
Yeah, exactly, Judy. I mean, we talked about a little bit on Friday, but being survey ready at all times,
Yeah.
not waiting till you're 30 days can expect, that to happen. It's like, and CASA does provide resources to this effect. We actually have our annual conference coming up in June, and one of the learning tracks is hospice. So we are encouraging folks to consider coming and joining and being around other hospice providers where you can network and learn from each other. So that's, on our CASA website, and you can look at the dates, which are currently, I'll just kind of plug that really quick. Um, but it's in June. And then we also have learning tracks that are going on with the Hospice Administrator Certification Program in Las Vegas that's coming up in August. So, CASA is here to provide a lot of support to our members to make sure that they can really be set in the right direction, avoid, being caught in the crossfires of all of this. I mean, with the live discharge rate, obviously be cognizant of that from the start, and in any of those other, KPIs.
All right. Great session. We got to wrap it up there. And thank you. This conversation matters, because what's happening right now isn't just about enforcement. I think about access. It's about trust. And it's about whether the patients and families who need hospice the most will feel confident enough to say yes in order to get it. Big thank you to Judy Waltz from Foley and Lardner for joining us today. Judith, really appreciate it. And I was in on a lot of that conversation on Friday as well, and that was equally as good. And thanks to all of you for listening and for the work you do every day to care for patients and families across California. If you'd like to drop us a note about a topic you'd like us to discuss, or anything else you'd like to let us know, you can email us at info@CAHSAH.org. That's info@CAHSAH.org. New episodes of At the Table with CAHSAH drop every week. Subscribe, share it with your team, and be part of the conversation shaping home-based care in California. Thank you, Tanya. Always good to see you. Remember, this is your seat at the table. For everyone at CAHSAH, we'll see you next week.